So hello, everyone, and welcome back to another conversation of the cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today I am very happy and honored to have here as guest David Kirsh. David Kirsh is professor at University of California, San Diego, La Jolla, former department chair for cognitive science, current president of the ANFA, Academy for Neuroscience for Architecture, and visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. David Kirsh has authored a significant number of relevant publications within the field of cognitive science and neuroscience, in particular on the foundations of artificial intelligence, creative cognition, and ethnography. David, please.
Thank you very much, Maria. Well, in our conversations, you asked if I could cover a few different topics. So I hope you won't regard the presentation to be disjointed. I think they stitch together, but not as completely as I normally would. So the topic I'll talk about is how bodies and external things help us think. And more specifically, I'll start with the thinking with things, then thinking with our body, talk about interactivity and interfaces in buildings, and then social affordances, all topics you asked me. So in thinking with things, it's clear that we often interact with models and that these facilitate creativity. I chose an image of crumpling paper for obvious reasons, because you're architects. Hold on, I'm gonna hide the floating meetings. The claims that I have with respect to creativity and using that as an example of thinking with things is that it often emerges through interactive cognition. The standard view of creativity, as explained by psychologists, is essentially an internalist one, where the creative process is happening inside the mind through some kind of imagination or some kind of generative process. That's distinct from using the artifacts themselves as a component of creativity. No one ever denies that the creative person might sketch or use sculpt with materials, but the creativity is not supposed to partly reside in the distributed process between human and thing. It's supposed to be this, I do something out there, that's an action, but it's not a thinking, it's an action. I look at it, I see the result, then I internalize how I represent the outside thing. I think about that, then I make another decision, then I act again. And the looping process is just perception and action. It's not seen as a distributed process or an extended mind process where that itself is that the outside is actually a presupposed component of my thinking process, such as turning an object. It could be something I do outside rather than try to mentally rotate it. And if I'm working like that and I'm tightly coupled temporally, that process is a thinking process in my and many other people's view right now. So I'll talk more about artifact mediated cognition. I won't talk about notation mediated cognition, and then body mediated cognition, how the body itself is a constituent in the creative process or a thinking process. I'll then later go on to these social affordances and interactivity with buildings. So our artifact mediated cognition. Here is an example. Can we think with cards? Well, for an artificial intelligence system, clearly not. All the decisions about what card to put out next or what card to accept and then throw out is made internally, and it's just an action that's performed. But that has a curious property that if you were to reorder the cards, there would be no reason, no artificial intelligence system would ever reorder the cards. There's no point to that because you're not making a move in the outside world. You haven't changed the state, the competitive state of the game by reordering the cards. That's just some kind of odd thing that humans do. But if you see rather that ordering cards is part of a way in which we change things outside to facilitate cognition inside, then instead of seeing these making the decisions inside and then making a move outside, what we have is we have internal operators, but then we can perform an external operator to reshuffle the cards or reorder the cards and reorder them again and then come back. And we could find our way to this position by going through external operators rather than internal operators, which might be harder or slower or faster or not lead us to see certain things. So in this view, we have in the head and in the world cognition. That's when the agent is appropriately coupled temporally, tightly coupled. You don't hear this. Oh, okay, I'm going to try to fix that. Excuse me.
We see the video, we just don't hear any sound.
Right, well, all right. I just, in case there's sound that should be heard, let's just see if this works now. Excuse me for this. Well, it's possible there's no sound here. I'll fix it later. All right, well, so what's happening here? Does the master actually know in advance what he's going to do? In this case, it's a he, I believe. The calligraphy is essentially an emergent process that comes through the interaction. And some of it most decidedly has to do with the pressure on the brush, because that's one of the things he's controlling. But exactly how it emerges, it's such a tightly coupled process temporally that the creativity, what's interesting about it is emerging jointly through the in and the out. When people are playing with models, what role does the model play? So they can't fully predict what they will see or think before doing it. And moreover, the notion of compliance, which is here I have a cup. When I bring my hand and I squeeze around the cup, the final position of my hand, odd as it is the result of just pulling tendons tightly around something. That process of how exactly it's going to end up is very computationally intensive, and people don't compute it. They just use their body for that. The tendons make this elastic force around it, pulling it tightly. Now, they don't know what's going to happen until they twist it, and where it twists depends on the shapes that they're working with and how they're joined. So they can't predict what it is. And yet that's partly how they're exploring the problem, is through this physical interaction with the outside. In this famous picture of Crick and Watson, the physical setup of the double helix as the model of DNA was very central to their understanding of how the crystallography solutions and deciding what were the right crystallographic solutions and so on. But what I like about this is that when you have something outside and you're talking about it, there's multimodal timing. You're speaking and gesturing, and there's this interaction and there's joint activity. The one is looking at what the other is doing. They're thinking collectively, and particularly the pace of thinking is partly determined by the thing you're pointing to and its shape and size. People don't study pace very much or at all, in fact, in cognition. And I think it's a very central question, how pace is involved in many of our processes, including, of course, in how buildings determine pace. So the bottom line of this part is that we often think by coordinating internal and our external activity with artifacts. So it's a coordination between what goes on in our head and what we are doing with the artifacts. Now let's just look example at how this further stimulates creativity through the case of ambiguity. So who among you, how many of you, if you just speak out, Who sees a face here? Who sees a woman? Well, apparently none of you see either, but
I see both, but I was waiting for, okay, Rafael also sees. Rafael, you can speak up, woman or face?
well,
I see a woman.
Okay.
So.
did you see a man?
Each in turn.
Okay, there you go. So once you see it, of course, you toggle back and forth. It's just initially, but this is an example, as we've seen in so many cases, of a duck rabbit or the famous Necker cube and so on, where you see one thing and you conceptualize it in one way, because not only do you see not only do you see it as a pattern of a certain sort, so you conceptualize it like that, you have a name for it, then you get this new perception. Now, how can working with the outside lead us to these new discoveries that might be useful? So the idea would be that this shape is ambiguous. It's multiply interpretable. So here I take a shape, and what shapes can you see here? Well, you could see three X's. You could see 3 clipped hexagons. You could see a triangle with 3 small V's coming out of it. You can see in this almost what you want to see. You could even see the torso of an oversized male. So you're free to change what we see almost at will, but interaction helps enact the change, and that is where the extra comes from. So I say, what do you see here? And you're going to start your little organization process, making your gestalts here and there. But what if we were to rotate the object, or occlude it with part of your hand, or stretch it, or move your head in, or move your head to side, or zoom in and out? These are not uncommon interactions that architects do with various sorts of images, and they help you see it in different ways. Here's another example. Now, please, can you all simultaneously call out what you see?
Square.
There.
Okay, so I'm gonna go through it, call it out quickly, okay?
Square.
Square.
Square. Square.
Diamond.
Diamond.
Okay, so here we go through this process, and you see a square, you see a square, you see a square, and now everybody, some people were not sure here, but everybody's sure that's a diamond, right?
Yeah.
So just this act can bring about a changed perception. Now, if you were talking about an ontology of what's out there, in the one world, it's filled with squares, but suddenly just by rotating it, it can be filled with other things. Here's another case. Now, in this case, it's a chance encounter. All right. Yes, I'm sure it's safe. But anyway, the thing is, without the physical action, there would be no chance encounters, because you wouldn't be encountering things like that. I mean, you could see things you never saw, but physical interaction allows us to have a degrees of freedom over things that we otherwise wouldn't have. The outcome was not predictable in the sense that it's hard to do the transformation in the head. And so you really don't get the impact of the result. It's possible, but in this case, it's not too hard. But in other cases, you can readily guess it's too hard. And the interaction wasn't really a standard move in the sense of, had they been building this thing, they're manipulating parts. They're not used to manipulating the whole object when it's a physical object. You could say they are, because that's the space of possibility in a physical model of this size. Larger one, not. But it's not the ordinary move, which is why they didn't see it before. And what the result is that we can do things outside that we can't reliably do inside our heads. Okay, so the bottom line is that we can stimulate creativity by interacting with things, partly because we suddenly see things that are hard to imagine. And this is a different, it's not a shocking view, but it is not the view, surprisingly, that is a prevalent or dominant view inside the science of creativity, the study of creativity. I want to segue now into thinking with our body and how we use our body itself as something to think with, to facilitate thought. So the question is, do dancers or choreographers ever use their body as a model to think with? So now look at this dancer. He's practicing, or he's practicing. And what is he doing? He is not dancing in the way that he would dance the real performance. So why would he do this if he can't be practicing any bit of it that he would display? He might get the rhythm right, so he might be practicing the rhythm, but it's a real abstraction in the sense that his body isn't doing the things he will do in performance. They're doing it in a tiny version and quite different with. So that way of dancing is called marking. And in this case, the dancers are marking in order to think of new movements. So some of them they already have, and then they're seeing if they can change them or advance them in some way. And the way I understand this is they're using their body as a scaffold to dynamically visualize possibilities. So they're doing this little thing, but they're visualizing doing the bigger thing. And they'll do this for hours in a way in which you would never dance full out for hours. So when I was studying dance creation with Wayne McGregor, the choreographer of the Royal Ballet, this is his contemporary company, Random Dance. And they came to UCSD. Wayne and I met up and we liked each other. And so we decided to collaborate on some things, which lasted eventually 7 years. And I would always go to London if he would make a new dance with his company. And I would capture it with 6 cameras. And I would sit there the whole time and watch. And I would interview him morning and night or regularly. In the first year, morning and night, an hour each time. And try to begin to understand what exactly was going on. And then later did some interviews with the dancers on a number of topics, one of which was marking. Now you look at this and on the one hand, your eyes just say, well, I know what they're doing, kinda. But on the other, if you look at it the way a cognitive scientist might, you say, what on earth are they doing really? And that's what I asked, what on earth are they doing really? So the idea is somehow that what they're doing, they're not doing it just because they get tired. If they did it full out all the time, it serves a cognitive purpose beyond the purpose of allowing them to practice longer. And the idea that I was exploring was that it lets them scaffold their imagination. A scaffold is something that gives you support, which otherwise it takes away some of your degrees of freedom. So it gives you support as long as the degrees of freedom it takes away are ones you're happy having taken away. Like on the side of a building, something that keeps you supported up high, so the degree of freedom of falling down the z-axis is not there. So the idea that if it's scaffolded, you can think faster or think harder or more precisely and with less effort, and you might also be able to learn faster or better, which was something I tested. Now, this is marking. Okay, this is the full out dance. And marking is doing it in a less energetic manner. And in this case, on fingers instead of legs. And when she's doing it on fingers, she's imagining the leg motion. I met this woman coincidentally at the American Airlines Club while we were both waiting for planes to go to different places. I don't know how we struck up a conversation, and it turns out that she was one of these Irish dancers. And I said, do you know how to finger mark? And she looked at me and she said, well, of course I know how to finger mark. And I had been waiting to get a good video of someone finger marking, and I took out my camera and took it right there. So that's a lovely case of finger marking, and you can find interesting whole productions of broader finger marking broader than just finger marking on the on YouTube. But so what is marking? Well, it's skeletal in the sense that it's some of the raw underpinnings without the extras that is an understructure that can be projected onto. Projection is, if I were to ask you to fill in X's and O's, play a game of X's and O's or tic-tac-toe in your mind, you would you would visualize a tic-tac-toe board with the two lines, two parallel lines, one set here and one set here. And then you put an X and you'd put an O and you'd put an O there and you play the game out. Now, when you do that in your mind, that's called imagination. When you do what I just did and you imagine it, I call that projection. So here's the board. You all see that board, right? And now I put the X in that corner, and I didn't put it in any old place. You knew I put it in the right place. So what is that process that is like imagination, but projected onto the world? That that projection is a kind of imagery onto the world, onto space. So whereas the size of the X and O board in your mind, when you're imagining it with your eyes closed, you can't tell me how big it is, or you can't tell me exactly where it is in space. I mean, you could imagine it in a place with a size, but when you just do the X's and O's, it's almost disembodied free-floating X and O of any arbitrary size, because that is not what is important to the mental image. But when you do it outside, you have to tie it to a specific, you have to anchor it to a specific location and so on. So now you can look for properties here. And similarly, if I show you a geometric problem and I ask you to try to solve it, you start to do, here I give you a right angle triangle, and I say, oh, you start putting in projections as you see whether this or that might work and help you solve the problem. All of that is projection. So my belief is that what they do when they do marking is that they physically provide this understructure, this scaffold, they project onto it, and because they have the scaffold, they're able to get more veridicality, more precision in their mental image of it. And that, well, it's in the projection. So, of course, the outside is an imperfect physical model of the real phrase. It's a 3D moving sketch, if you like, and it's an abstraction. But when they do this, the dancers attend to very specific parts of the movement, and they conceptualize that aspect more completely than they are doing it. So if they're interested in a particular arm motion, they might do that arm motion and fixate on their fingers, and their fingers are approximately the position they want, but what they're actually fixating on might be more precise, and certainly it would be tied into a more integrated movement. So a marked movement is a sort of abstraction, but it's represented internally in a more detailed manner. And now here I got a few of them to come out and show me. Here Antoine is doing a full out phrase. So the dancers don't need music to dance. They love music, they like to dance with music, they enjoy music, but they don't need it. They have the clock inside. So his timing will be perfect. And this is his full out phrase that he did, not in the actual dance that they were just making at the time. All right, I'm showing you the whole thing. I know it's quite long. All right, and now I said, Antoine, just mark that. Now look at how much smaller it all is and how much less effort there is. It's still quite complete. He could, in principle, leave some things out. He certainly could leave some body movements out.
Great. How come you made the sounds now when you marked it? You didn't make sounds before when you did it for real. Were you thinking it through?
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing it as I go.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's also maybe, it's not a rhythm. It's not to get a rhythm, it's just to, it's like a help.
All right, so there's something going on between what he's thinking in his head and, oh, in this case, he's also making sounds that are facilitating his performance. Now we're going to look at one more, and this is small marking. Look at this. And before he had actually raised a leg, now there's nothing like raising a leg. There's just this tiny little thing. Dancers will even mark on the metro, the subway, the tube on their way home. So they can practice in all sorts of places if they're just marking. And that is the difference between full, large marking and small marking.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, she's marking full.
Full.
That was full.
Yeah, but it wasn't really
And the
because she didn't.
marking it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not using energy, but I'm thinking, what's my pathway? Or
All right. So her real full wasn't quite as full as it would have been. She was speaking. She didn't have quite as much emotion in her movement as she would on stage. But the key thing she's emphasizing is the energy, and she's thinking the pathway is the movement along the, more or less along the floor that Laban used to characterize one of the ways that dancers, what you need to mark down in order to know what the dancer is going to do. So here's a case where
this is the smallest one.
this is the smallest one. So she's here distinguishing between an actual tombe pas de bourrée and just a conventional gesture with the hands that indicate it. So that kind of marking is more symbolic than the other one, but it's used all the time. That the ballet instructor will put her finger around like this to indicate time now for a pirouette. And all right, so marking provides some kind of dynamic support for projection. Dancers project aspects of the full out phrase, so they're thinking with the movement that they would perform, and they project that onto the moving form that is not so full out. So this helps, the movement helps the dancers visualize, project, the aspects that they might want to explore specifically. They're not concentrating on every aspect of the full out movement. They're concentrating, or on the marked movement, they're concentrating on a specific aspect typically. And movement does some of the work of visualization by scaffolding or supporting the projection. And it also provides an integration. So if they want to look at a particular part, they still has to be in situ. It still has to be part of the integrated thing. And this motor focus helps them to direct attention on key elements. Now, this idea of marking is all over the place. People just haven't studied it or noticed it before. These are synchronized flyers, the French Acrobatic Patrol. I'm sorry, I've forgotten their name. They're the, I don't know, the Armée de l'Air. So I didn't give you the full thing, but you can even see this guy who was the captain, when they bank steeply and they're turning it, you can even see him enduring the G stress. So they're really thinking this is what it's going to be like in flight, and they have to get the synchronized movement, so they practice it on land. And they do it by marking. Here, there's a whole body language for marking synchronized swimming. So here's hands for legs, and you saw that we did fingers for legs in Irish river dancing.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
All right, so you can see how they practice, and it's through marking. It's not the same as when they're in the water. All right, so my bottom line here is that in these, at least these physical creative activities, or in synchronized activities, people are going to use their bodies quasi-symbolically. So if it's among others, they could look at each other and see what they're doing. But in the case of individuals, they're using their body as like the brush. It's scaffolding. They're thinking, they're practicing, they're cognizing, their creativity, their exploration, and the body is essential to it. So the body is an instrument of cognition there, the same way that somebody using notations or somebody using external models would be. So these are now two examples, one where we've used external physical artifacts and one where you're using the body itself as a thing to think with. Now, moving to interactivity in buildings, I wrote a very long paper on interactivity in buildings, and it really was a contrast between interactivity as is conceptualized in HCI. In fact, it's not well conceptualized. So the inquiry itself was a study on how to think about interactivity. It's a new theory of interactivity, but not new in the sense that it introduces something completely novel, except in one way. It characterizes causal interactivity, and then it shows a difference between that and network interactivity. So there's a clear account of what it is to have network interactivity. Perhaps that's a contribution, but the third area is sort of social interactivity or building interactivity, and that's quite different than the other two. But I don't have time to give that talk. I do have a paper, maybe you want to share it with people. So when you talk about interactivity in human-computer interaction, the interaction takes place at an interface where the one, A, is interacting with B, and B acts back on A. So it's bidirectional. A interacts with B and causes a state change in B. B causes a state change in A. But the way they do it is always mediated. There's a point at which there is the interface between A and B. They're not allowed to be the same thing in order to for us to define it, because it is a relationship between two things, A and B. So there must be some gap between A and B. That is like separation in some sense, a physical distinction between A and B. That physical distinction is the interface, and it's conceptualized as a surface. It could be n-dimensional surface, but it's a surface. For instance, the analog digital, where we have our hands moving over something, we have our mouse input, that is, we're doing these physical actions, and then so we have physical digital, and then it's going into the digital world and changing things in the digital world. And we talk about the interface as that's one interface, the physical digital interface. Another interface is what we see and how we manipulate it on the screen, but the screen is not real in a certain sense of seeing the things. When you come to buildings, everything is three-dimensional, and you say, well, what's the interface? We know people are interacting with the buildings, but what's the interface? And it was absolutely paradoxical to me. I must have spent over a month trying to figure out what on earth is the interface. I had a lovely conversation with Alan Penn, and where I was talking to him about interface in buildings, and I asked him, what did he think? And he said, well, when we're having this conversation in the room, we're in one interface. If I open the door, it's a completely different interface. And he was meaning that the social context has been changed because of the lack of privacy. So for him, the interface was different in the sense of the context of activity. It's a three-dimensional thing. It's not easy to understand. So I started thinking about this, and that is what that paper is about. It tries to define what architectural interfaces are, and of course, architectural interactivity. So we know that, I mean, this is clearly an interface of sort. Just by putting that thing there, not only does it prevent water from getting on the people, but it's got a lot of social consequences. Here's a space designed for all different sorts of, it's Microsoft, possibly, I think it's in London, one of the early Microsoft campuses in London, and it's designed for, well, not early, designed for different forms of social interactions. And you can see that they have created, through the use of carpet and furniture, one kind of region. These are all different activity spaces. Normally you don't expect people to do concentrated work here, but in fact, some people like to do concentrated work, and all of these constitute different little social interfaces. Here's a very clear case of it, the hatch of the 1950s and 60s. So a serving hatch has a real social interface. It really defines what you can and can't, not what you can and can't do. Somebody could stand here and have a philosophical talk with somebody in the kitchen. If one person were sitting here and the other person were sitting here, fine. But typically one person is working in here and the other people are socializing in here. And there's a social distinction between the kinds of activities that go on, who's in here, who's out here. This is laden with social implications. Here's another one, a more recent one, and it really constrains the nature of social interaction in terms of how frequent and how easy the conversations are going to be and what the topics will be. If you want to have a more social cooking activity, you can open up the space. And here we have the equivalent of a sushi bar, a style thing. And the cook is over here, and this is more of a show with a free interaction between the people. So these are defining different kinds of social interfaces. We have more social interfaces. Every building provides us with countless social interfaces. Circumscribing the interface is not so easy, and that makes it hard to specify what exactly the social affordances are, because the social interface is determining a lot of the affordances, and those are also social affordances. We haven't defined what a social affordance is, but the intuitive notion of a social affordance is that it is a structure which facilitates or makes possible, gives the opportunity for certain sorts of social interactions, and it doesn't facilitate all social interactions. So it's a subset, and we'd like to understand how they work. Now, the concept of intelligibility in architecture, or readability, or the semiotics of the space, that is something that's closely related to this, because people see what the space can be used for, or how you could read it as being something that is appropriate for this or that. So when somebody is scanning the room, the two people come in and they say, come on, let's have a conversation. They scan around, they choose something, and both know which what regions would work and what wouldn't work. So there's a kind of intelligibility to the space. If you come into a restaurant, you want to know the properties of the space and the social, the interface of it, then different areas provide different kinds of interfaces if owing to privacy and what's in gaze, what can be seen. So the space of interaction and social possibility is always being physically constrained by the architecture. The interior design too, but the architecture is, of course, massively important. And it's hard to analyze building interfaces. It's hard to know exactly what adding a wall will do to change the socio-spatial interface, or removing a table or chair, or opening a door, but they do alter social affordances. And so would introducing a mobile phone or a group printer. So it's very hard to know what is the social affordance, what is the social interface, the socio-spatial interface. But I think it's a topic worth understanding. If you look in an ordinary room, here would be like a college dorm or something, or somebody's room, it contains many potential interfaces for either social interaction or for physical task activity. Those are interfaces more broadly, but we could confine ourselves to social interaction. And you know perfectly well, I mean, cleaning, if it's done with another person, is a social act. It's a joint activity. So of course is playing, but sharing a closet could also be a joint activity, a social act, of course. So there's many kinds of social activities, and each one of them might take place in a different area. And they come into being when the people bring themselves into certain relations, so that space now is being used in that way, because the people are part of the affordance now, and you couldn't have a social affordance. The social, it affords the possibility for social interaction, but when a person is there, it affords it in a different way. If the person sits in a particular part, they're occupying a particular place. So you can't really fully understand it without understanding the dynamics that go on. They're part of that niche. And in the end, I came to view architectural interfaces as like a niche, a sort of social bubble. And when you do that, you can avail yourself of certain kinds of formal techniques for analyzing things. It's very many dimensional and it's very complicated, but it seems to me that is essentially, we wouldn't think that interaction in architecture is not as complicated as animal interaction with their environment. So no surprise. When you want to understand the nature of social affordances or these niches, you have to look at what social interaction really is. So here is a case, my favorite case of joint activity. The mother knows what to expect from him. He knows what to expect from her. He knows that if he doesn't do that, she's going to pull his hands up or do something. So they both are predicting how the other will behave. They both have a whole range of expectations. They're not supposed to have to talk, but if she does talk, then it's explicit regulation. So they're kind of making sure that the communication via an explicit method is saying what to do next. So they're coordinating their activities, sometimes explicitly, but sometimes the activity is coordinated implicitly because he knows what to do. She knows the order in which to do it, as does he. So when she starts tugging at his shirt down below and brings it up like this, is it coming down or coming up? I think she's just taking it off myself, but maybe she's putting it on. He knows that. So that was implicit coordination, if it's a he. I don't know that either. And
I think it's a she.
And you know, it just doesn't matter any longer.
It doesn't.
Now, compare the dressing in here with dressing in here. These are different sort of architectural interfaces. There's the lighting is different. The space, of course, is the big paramount difference. If they were to be working in here, we know the position that they would have to take in some way. There'd be a lot of different actions going on. So the interfaces are so different that although the general structure of behavior would be similar, we could expect significant differences. And this is part of what makes the concept hard to apply, but part of what makes it rich to apply, because of course, if we thought we were designing the closet to enable dressing in the closet, we might have designed it in a slightly different way. So we have different interfaces, and these constitute different socio-ecological bubbles that people operate in. So if you want to understand what's so special about social niches, I think a good way to understand it, that is human social niches, you ask yourself, well, what would it take to get a robot to participate appropriately? And when people are talking with each other, they're obviously people and not just, not digital things. So there's this back and forth that is cognitively demanding, even if he's doing all the speaking and he's doing all the gesturing. Well, of course, he's gesturing too, but there is a back and forth, even if the words are coming out of his mouth because of his his responsiveness to his gestures and facial expression, which is a response to what he's saying and his facial and physical gestures. So we know that social interaction is cognitively more demanding than very many physical interactions. And the interpersonal part of it recruits extra neural regions or systems not required during ordinary physical action. So it's not just the I know that you know that I know, although that's an important part. It's all the social relations that go, all the social neuroscience that has to do with emotional regulation and more that I wish I could just enumerate for you. So we have to identify social intent and identify the social act. And that's not so simple as just seeing what is being done. Social interaction also recruits more neural regions than simple observation of someone else acting. So observation of someone else acting could be I mean, there's a social element to it. That is, we're seeing social, something social, but if we're not ourselves participating, that's different. What do you think this woman is responding to? I'd be curious to know. I have two primary conjectures.
Maybe someone bumped into her.
That is definitely my primary conjecture. Another conjecture? All right. So that, I mean, his level of concern and her, she's not saying, whoa, he's hot. Although initially, if you saw it in a different context without him and stuff, but the degree of frowning and so on, I think he just bumped into her without paying any attention. So we can draw some pretty powerful social inferences and tell a story just on the basis of a snapshot. So that's going to take a lot of cognition. But when they're actually involved, it goes beyond that. And you could consider the arousal that would be happened in here. That becomes, she's just been hit, so she's actually pretty pissed off, probably. Might have hurt, we don't know. And so the ability to adapt to the other person goes beyond just the understanding of the social intent. So I think one of the big things is this being involved, being a participant, having what they call skin in the game, is what happens in true social interaction. And that makes it something more than just picking up your pen.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we need to pay a little bit of attention to the time.
All right, I have probably 3 minutes left. Okay, would that be okay?
Yeah. All
right, sorry, it just got away from me. So when you look at the interface, there are these other things that are happening. There's shared delight, there's embodied interaction, there's joint activity. The consequence is that we have a lot of elements that are present through having social co-presence and interaction. Both people are sharing situational awareness. Both people have agency, so they can participate in joint activity. Both people have emotions, and they're aware of each other. Those are all elements that we don't typically find. I'm not going to go into them, Ben, but sharing a physical space, if you want to understand the nature of social interaction or social affordances, you have to begin to have a better grasp of what is involved in sharing an action space for joint activity, because a conversation or any of those things are joint activity. Sharing emotional awareness. If you now just look at these things, you say, well, what are the social affordances here? It's fairly constrained what you're looking at, but you wouldn't call this a good singles bar. I wouldn't. I don't know singles bar, but I'm guessing that's a bad one. It looks to me like it would be a bad one. Here we can see immediately that this is not a face-to-face venue. I mean, it's an audience-to-face venue. So it highly constrains the nature of social interaction. On the other hand, the reason this is better for singles is because they're not being clustered in some way that really allows you to talk in threes or fours. It's meant to be for more binary conversations. And then we have social legibility that tells us this has got a lot of power. So when we look at a structure like this, we too can imagine the social affordances that each of these things provides, including someone occupying the space. He occupies a space, there's a power relation now. You have to face him. You can't sit beside him, you have to face him. And similarly, these people now, they can sort of use this to mediate between them and then share things. All of these represent notions of social affordances, which I think is just completely understudied. In fact, we don't really talk much about social affordances. So the conclusions are just that humans can use both their bodies and external things to think with. Interaction is a source of creativity by revealing things we didn't imagine. Interaction in buildings is really complicated because the interface is 3D and it's hard for us to know what that means. And it typically includes other people. When you want to understand social interaction, where people are, of course, co-present, they are usually assumed to be co-present physically, and that has cognitive and emotional consequences, such as sharing emotions, sharing situation awareness, sharing common ground, and sharing many goals. Very hard to achieve that through digital presence. This is the canonical structure, and obviously, if we have avatars in spaces, we're going to try to create this sort of thing. But I think the physical co-presence is very special, and that's all I want to say. Okay.
Thank you, David. Can you please maybe stop sharing your screen so we can all
Absolutely. Yep. There we go.
see each other? This was really a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, David. So much information, and I was very happy to let you go with it a little extended with the time, because then we can go a little bit deeper and not hurrying through these topics. And while you were presenting, I was also making many connections, because you know that I also work with these topics of movement, so there would always be so much to talk about. But I would just like to start our conversation with the topic of marking, which I think has so much potential for architects and for interior designers, because as you showed us the dancers doing these marking movements, I very often also when I talk to my students, I make this comparison that when we're moving, we are always drawing and painting in space. This is in some ways is also a personal experience I have with my experience with performance, and also with my whole background with drawing and painting, and then going to architecture. And I think that when we as architects and designers, when we're sketching, what we are very close to doing what dancers do with marking. And I also found very interesting that you had in one of these slides about marking, there was a sketch of a human body, so just marking of gesture. And I had to think also of the paintings from Kandinsky, that he was also doing these abstractions, and many people didn't know, but he was really working with movement. They can almost be analyzed like diagrams. So I would like to ask you, did you also do this kind of studying like you did for marking? Did you also do it for sketching in architecture?
Not in architecture, and I haven't really done it for sketching, but in thinking about the topic, yes, I have looked at sketching more than a little, but not a lot. There are a lot of interesting attributes of sketching, it seems to me. Of course, projection is one of them. But superposition is another one. So you can't get superposition easily in everyday life because of time. So, but superposition, I can, when I do one thing through sketching and then I don't change the page, I do it on top, I get superposition. So that's a case of something that'll be very hard to do just in your head. You can do a little bit, but not so well in your head. So there are a whole range of the relation to sketching is complicated because of in any case of interaction, you're subject to the constraints of the medium. So the sketching medium, which would in this case, could you choose, your pen or your your thick brush is going to have an effect on what the output looks like. I guess also sometimes people will use, here's one of the nicest things of sketching, a nice crisp example. So a problem in archaeology, I guess the prehistory, is determining whether a stone is human-made or whether a stone is nature-made. You know, they have these stones for knapping, for breaking other stones to make them into, arrowheads and spearheads and stuff. And these stones, which I've had the pleasure of holding one from, 50,000 or 40, 30,000 years ago, they are obviously perfect for this, the way they are weighted and stuff. But the product, like, is it a spearhead that a human made, or did they pick this up? Those are these lithic stones. And it's a genuine problem to decide whether it's, which it is, nature or human made. The method is almost like a proof procedure. What you do is you take out the book on lithic illustration, and lithic illustration tells you how to take the stone and now copy it. And you make a mark like this if it looks like this on this side, and you do it like, and there's a small set of rules for how to do it. And then when you end up, what you end up with is a beautiful sketch of the stone. Now, if all the important factors of the stone you were able to express according to the rules of sketching, lithic illustration, it's a human-made stone. And if a lot of them don't fit, it's not a human-made stone. So here is a proof procedure for, so you can do crazy things with sketching, but then maybe it's not what you were really asking.
No, but this is also a really interesting thread. Now, I was interested in the connection between sketching and marking, because I also had to think about, I went into performance exactly because I was bored with drawing and painting. And I thought that this is too constraining. I want, because when I move through space, I can feel like I'm a brush, as you were saying with dancers. So there's a lot going on. And what happens when skin touches air? There's also the void. There's also space, which is also a material in itself. It also has a quality. So when I was already in performance for some time and working on this, I saw a talk by Matthew Barney, the artist Matthew Barney, who works with all these media. And he's very interested in working with the body as a plastic material. And he also works with sculpture, installation, many things. And in this talk, he mentions that he always ends the whole process of whatever he's working on, which normally takes almost 10 years to produce. He always ends it with drawings, because the drawings are the most distilled essence of everything which was performed. And his work is highly performative, including sculpture and everything. And I found this really interesting because in some way it's picking up drawing also in the reversed way. So not just as a starting point, but also something that we finish. And very often I had conversations with historians of architecture and theoreticians who are always highly suspicious of, with good reason, of the genius sketch of the architect. So how is it that they fly to one location, take a look, make a little sketch, and then it's done, and we develop the project from there? So I had many conversations where I was asked this question, and there was a discussion about this. But I think that what happens very often is that a very, very experienced architect with huge talent, of course, and experience in building, is able to use sketching exactly in this way as a form of marking. So I had to think about it when you showed us this example with the dancers, because in some ways it's a kind of cost-effective, on a cognitive way, cost-effective way of picking up threads of an idea and putting it into a workable surface.
Yeah, it's really complicated. One difference, though, I think, is the fact that marking is in time and doesn't have that superposition quality to it. So what you get in marking that you don't get in sketching, for instance, is that in marking, you get pace and time. And part of what they do, the dancers, in fact, is one of the only things that they really preserve is the timing. So when they mark it, they're usually marking. In fact, the phrase marking is marking in time.
Mhm.
And but in sketching, you throw away time and you're left with these. I mean, you can say, oh, I can follow that line. I see it started here and it ended there. This is where it was before, it was over there. But if somebody did it the reverse way, you might say, well, I wouldn't think of it that way, but if they did, they did. So you can't really read off the time in a sketch, and you can't. I mean, you can layer arbitrary things in a sketch, but you can't layer the temporal elements in marking. But I think it's important because if you're going to have your students or your colleagues something like dance, okay, through a space, or imagine themselves dancing through a space or moving through a space in order to encounter the space in a certain sort of way and understand some of the properties of the space in a certain sort of way. Time and pace and rhythm is really important. And that would come out in the marking if they got the pace right. But if they're just going through the motions and they're doing it at the wrong speed, the nature of interaction is completely different because of the importance of speed and time in real life.
Mhm.
So you can't juggle, you can juggle in slow motion, but and you could practice something in slow motion, but really about juggling, there's something to do with getting the timing just right and the weighting just right. I mean, you don't get the weight right if you pretend your hand, the weight is very different. The force structure is different because force is over time.
Exactly. And also about, and now that you mentioned the weight, and I have to think about gravity and also the difference it makes to be working on an idea with a sketch alone and having the model. And this little video you showed with a student flipping the model and having the wow epiphany, it's really fantastic because I think every architecture student should have this experience to understand the wonder of hidden affordances, which is a term I also really appreciate. And we start now talking about affordances. I also found very interesting that you showed all these possibilities in connection to interactivity with buildings, and also an interesting array of very scripted spaces or spatial situations. And here the performative brain kicks in, because when you show these images, I was always imagining hidden affordances, how we could deconstruct the protocols of use of this space. So and here I would like to bring the topic of context, because of course when we design an interior space, we are always, or also a building in general, we are always having in consideration the context. So the material context, and also the cultural context. So we are somehow creating some boundaries that allow for some kind of known scripts. But we also know that we want buildings to evolve and to be adaptable and to change over time. So how can we make or have some kind of scaffold, to use your expression, that we can use in design, that we know we are scripting this space somehow, we know that we are proposing these affordances, but what could be a useful scaffold that we can have that doesn't let those scripts become too rigid, that allows this ambiguity that you also talked about in the beginning?
All right, well, thank you for that really interesting question, because it makes me appreciate that an affordance is this, you use the word hidden, but I mean, yeah, many people don't perceive all the affordances that are present. For Gibson, the concept of affordance was an objective relation that held between the action repertoire of a person or an animal and the material structures out there. So if for a person without legs, the stairs do not afford climbing. For a person with legs, they afford climbing. Now, we might perceive some things, even though we don't have the capacities, but at the animal level, we don't perceive them even. All right, so we can draw the distinction between affordances that are there that we don't notice, and we might not realize until we're in the moment of action. And then ideally for Gibson, we would notice them because that's part of what perception is. However, the point that you made, that constitutes an alteration in what I'm now thinking, and so I'm grateful, is that when you have two people, the action repertoire has to be defined for the two. So there are, if you have a classic case of joint activity, those saws where you have big saws where two people are sawing them together to get the log, and it's a big saw, or it's a one like that with two handles. Okay, the two-person saw, they would call it a two-man saw, and it's mediated by the saw, and the action is regulated, but each person has to do the right thing, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that saw does not afford sawing for one person. It affords sawing for two people, but it doesn't afford sawing for one person. So, I mean, in a way that's obvious, and we understood this, but I never realized that if you're going to do the analysis, you have to do the analysis with respect to defining the action repertoire of the collective. So we'll have, in dancing, they have two-man Morris and three-man Morris and four-man Morris. They have these different kinds of that are performing actions. So now any group in the space will find new affordances because there will be joint activity that can be done in the space that couldn't have been done by the individuals. So the space is automatically open. On the other hand, we do a lot to a space that is meant to enforce a certain sort, it's meant to, if not constrain, it's meant to sort of conceptually constrain what people see and what people think they can do or ought to do in a space. And that's, some of that is the ought is the conventions, but can is there's the other notion of can, which is not permission, but is possibility. So architecture is always very free, it seems to me. If you change the interior design a little bit without changing the spatial structure, I've never known where architecture ends and where, I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright actually designed the clothing and the cutlery for in some of the houses. So as far as he was concerned, architecture was very total. But I guess people have different professions. I don't know, therefore, but I'm just saying the way into the problem is to begin to ask about what are the things that could be done in the space, independently of whether people recognize that they could be done in the space. And probably there are like a vast number of things that could be done in the space. If you were to bring a circus or jugglers or do all sorts of things into the space, or your type people who are crazy about doing some kind of funny interactive, I'm not saying funny, I just mean non-standard interaction.
Non-normative, yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, not normative in the sense of usual or habitual. So I don't know, no answer, but the key thing is that action repertoire gets changed by the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also wanted to bring this because very often I think about people, for example, who are neurodiverse and who some might have difficulties with spatial navigation and so on. And very often they struggle with highly scripted spaces because their natural wiring maybe doesn't allow them to understand the protocol immediately. So they might struggle to understand, oh, okay, this is where I'm supposed to go, and this I shouldn't really be sitting here. I should be sitting there. So I was also thinking about this because recently I read about how new office spaces are also taking in consideration the potential of people, for example, with Asperger's, because they can be highly gifted in particular ways of working, and how to create workspaces which also have affordances that are useful and help them thrive. So I was also thinking to include also this perspective.
Well, okay, so you're drawing, I'm going to generalize, you're drawing the distinction there between the behavioral account, which I was giving in terms of the action repertoire, and the sort of the concept, the cognitive component, or whatever component we want to have that says that, all right, it still can come back to behavioral repertoire, thank goodness. But imagine that to do something, you have to do 4 steps, and they have to be timed and they have to be done correctly. So one person who is skilled in the timing and execution of those steps, do we define an action repertoire over simple actions or compound actions or scripted actions? What are we going to count as the size of the action? And if an action has like mini scripted things, like flipping an egg over easy, so that you just get the other side. There's a lot of steps in the flipping the egg over easy. You got to get the spatula under the egg. You have to get it just right. You have to manipulate the pan. You have to flip it over correctly. How many actions are involved in that? Do we want to say, oh, there's one action called flipping over easy? Or do we want to say there's all these other actions? So now that means that the skill of a person or the capacity of a person is a factor in defining the action repertoire. And a tightrope does not afford walking across a cavern, a giant space falling down below for me. Even if I could walk on a tightrope, I couldn't do it if it was over a high space. So how we define the action repertoire is really complicated. And in the case of neurodiversity, we could then cash it all out, convert it all to action repertoires.
Okay, thank you. I would need more time to compute to go a little bit deeper into this, but for now, I wouldn't say that I'm satisfied, but I know that the time is running and I have to give the ball also to the students, and maybe Milton would also might like to make a question. Maybe our students can prepare a little now that I am like reactivating. Milton, would you like to make a comment?
Oh, I'd love to make many comments, David. I've got 8 pages of notes. So,
Wow.
but one would be just to plant a stick in the ground and say, what about aesthetic affordances and the action repertoire of responding to the object and its emotional qualities, which brings me into a different kind of interaction between an artist or architect who's not present, but whose intention is manifest in something, whether it's architecture or dance or music, whatever, and the person who is the participant. And there's an empathic potential in that relationship. So that's one thing I'd love you to comment on. I've got tons of others, but just that one.
The aesthetic one, or the empathic thing, or the?
I connect those two. I think for me, the aesthetic connection, when it's authentic, has an empathic component.
Okay, we doing one person or 2 people? Normally empathy is between humans.
I would say two humans, one's present, one's not. The maker's not present, but the thing that's made is.
You can't do that. Okay. No, the presence, it's what. So it isn't required of me. Affordance, the notion of affordance is got to be independent of the intention of the creator. So the creator can, I mean, if we have it as an objective notion, so whatever you may have intended from the art, I mean, I don't really care if you intended to make a car that can go 300 miles an hour. If the car can only go 120 miles an hour, that's it. So we have got to take it independent of the creator. Let's just take the thing there. And now the question is, what are the range of affordances that are there, and what are the range of affordances that are perceived? And can we still use this notion of an action repertoire to define the relation precisely, or is it in the end, this whole notion just going to be colorful language that people use intuitively, but in fact has no theoretical value? Because, you know, the way we chip away at it, and can I use it for this, and can I use it for that, in the end, it dilutes it and could possibly make it unusable in a rigorous way. Not that it isn't, you know, and people love to use the word affordance for all sorts of things. So now we could say, now we can take a really hard property, not can I walk across this, can I reach that, can I sit on this, can I cook with this, can I do some such and such, which are physical actions. And then we might want to extend the physical actions. People use affordances, you know, in HCI and human computer action in all sorts of ways. They say, oh, that affords this and that affords that. And when you ask it, what does it really mean? It doesn't mean the normal thing. So now you're asking a very complicated abstract property, aesthetic. Now, let us suppose that there were such a thing as an objective attribute. So there's a constellation of properties out there in a particular region, and we want to know, does it satisfy yet another property? Namely, does it have an aesthetic property? I don't know how to define it in that way, but that is, I mean, a simple way of posing the problem is to say, I have the structure, tell me, do you see what's beautiful about it? And now I've distinguished that between, so we already distinguished between the affordance as an objective property that is a certain relation between an action repertoire and an external playground on which you perform that action, that the outside enables or makes possible the performance of that action, like a room that you can walk into or crawl into, or a room that you can't even get into at all. So a room that's like the ceiling is too low doesn't afford getting into, or crawling or walking or any of those things. So that's the clearest kind of thing. Reaching your hand into something. Does it afford reaching your hand into something? Well, if it's flat, it doesn't afford reaching your hand into you. It's got to be curved, you know, this properties. So, okay, we have the objective property and then we have the perceived property, which is nice because in the field of aesthetics, philosophy of aesthetics, people are always bickering about whether or not it is an objective property or whether it's subjective. Is it in the eye of the beholder or is it not just in the eye of the beholder? So it's affordance. I guess I throw back to you when you're talking about aesthetic properties. Do you mean it affords seeing in this manner, or do you mean that it has this property? Because you know, you can take a little neurodiversity and they'll see possibly anything is beautiful or anything is horrifying. You just change the drip in a certain part of the brain. And on the one hand, they say, oh my God, that's so pleasant. And on the other hand, oh my God, it's terrifying. So you could do all sorts of
both at the same time could also happen.
Right.
All right. You know, you have a broader range of emotions than I do.
Well, the reason I'm raising intention is that in aesthetics is that that's part of the architectural process. We want something to be a certain way, and that's why we design it a certain way. But then we need to be open to seeing how it's actually used and learn from that and observe. But on the aesthetic side, I'm not worried so much about beauty or ugly. I'm worried more about whether there's an emotional connection that might relate to a pleasure center, or you know, or to other expression of other things.
Do you think it's always there? So suppose you're the deacon in Santa Sofia, and like the first time you walk in, and okay, the second time you walk in, the third time you walk in, and the fourth time you walk in, and now, okay, how about the 600th time you walk in? And you walk in and you say, oh, they didn't clean up properly here. Oh, they don't have enough incense. Oh, you know, all the things that go when you're familiar with a space. So this attitude about the emotional attribute, I'd like to know how you define it with respect to novelty versus familiarity. Because if something is hard, it's hard whether you see it the first time or encounter it the first time or the last time. These affordances are relative to action repertoire, but so, and they shouldn't wear out. but the aesthetic one that you're talking about, you say, oh, I can always put my mind into the space where I can see it that way. Yes, okay, but that's, that's too soft.
No, when I play or listen to Chopin, I don't get tired of it. So there must be some things that have more endurance than
You just
that.
haven't played it enough. But yeah.
Really?
I have to say that I played piano for 10 years and it was mostly classical. And when I started studying architecture and I didn't have so much time, I thought I had enough of classical music. I just want to do weird sounds with saws and things which are not supposed to do any sound, and I had enough. And since the pandemic, I'm listening to classical music again. So these things can always change.
Yeah.
So I'll work on the aesthetics part and we'll have more dialogue on that.
Sure, sure.
Now I would like our students who have been very, very quiet, and I also don't see them, I would like them to participate because I'm sure that they have questions. And I think that the talk was also very thought-provoking, many aspects that they didn't think of, but they have this assignment that they should analyze their patterns of movement during the pandemic, so the most recurrent actions, and perform them in a different context. So creating a little bit of storytelling with these movements from the pandemic. So who would like to go first with a question or a comment? Maybe Laura?
Poor Laura.
Because Laura made some very good questions before during our, great.
Actually, I just have a question about like the scientific background, because you told us a lot, but I'm interested a little bit more in the scientific proof of these kind of things. Could you talk a little bit about that?
A little bit. All right. So with respect to marking, I'll do the creativity and I'll do the marking, and I'll do projection. So with respect to marking, we had the dancers do we tested them, and we wanted to see, we did three forms. We had the dancers practice a piece, a movement, a phrase, a dance phrase, full out. We had them practice it, excuse me. We had them practicing it, doing it, marking it. And we had they had them practice it lying on the floor, eyes closed, imagining it. And we wanted to see which would facilitate performance better. So the assistant choreographer, she danced for them about a 1 minute phrase, which would be the equivalent of you or, well, maybe not you, but certainly me, having to memorize 2 or 3 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs and get it right word for word. Pretty damn hard. Okay, so they would watch her for 10 minutes and then they can not quite, but almost do it. So imagine memorizing 3 paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs. Anyway, we would grade them on their first effort. And then they had, I don't remember how many, 10 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes to practice it in one of these conditions. And we did it properly. So they were going against themselves, but with different phrases, and we compared it all. And what we found, we expected it to be full out would be best, because after all, you're doing it full out. We expected marking to be second best, and we expected imagination to be worst. And what we found was that marking was better than full out, and both were better than imagination. And so we were pleased and a little bit surprised by that. So then the question was why? And then you get this whole theory. But so empirically, I do not have support for the whole theory because it says a lot of different things. But first off, empirically, it's found that marking can facilitate learning and can facilitate learning better even than full out practice, which is a surprise because you would think that hitting the ball in a game, playing more games would normally be better, or even playing games against a something that threw the ball exactly at you for tennis would be better than just swinging the racket without the ball, that sort of thing. The second thing is that in order to explain the marking, I introduced the concept of projection. And so then what experiments did we do on projection? Well, so to test projection, to see whether projection facilitated was different than mental imagery and whether it facilitated performance. What we did was we gave them the tic-tac-toe case, and they had to play tic-tac-toe with somebody, but you had to do it either with your eyes open or blindfolded, and tic-tac-toe is too simple to actually do it full out. So we were comparing mental imagery versus eyes open, and you had to call out your move. So first they had to learn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, the cells on the board, on the tic-tac-toe board. And then I go 1, and I don't point, but I say 1, and then you say 5, because you've learned the board. So we can play the game 1, 5, 9, you know, that sort of way. And what we found was that if you put the board out there, so all you saw was a tic-tac-toe board, or you saw nothing, or you had your eyes closed. And what we found was that if the tic-tac-toe board was out there, you did better. Even though the state of the board does not change over time, the board is exactly the same every time everybody's playing, the board just stays there. The board was helpful by sort of scaffolding your mental projection. And actually the experiments, the findings were a little more subtle than that, because we had given everybody vividness of mental imagery. So we knew how good they were at a test. So we knew how good they were at mental imagery. And what we found was that the people who were really good on mental imagery didn't benefit at all from the board outside. Their mental image, it was a sufficiently simple task that they could see that all in their head anyway. In fact, some of them found the board to be a distraction. But the people who were bad on mental, who had much less effective mental imagers, they benefited quite considerably from having the board out there. So we increased the complexity of the task, and we made it a 4x4 board, where you have to get 4 in a row. So you know it's a 16. It's 16 cells, and now everybody does pretty badly in general. But even now but even the good visualizers now benefited from the board. So that was some justification that there is a different process going on in projection than in mental imagery per se, which is interesting because, shocking as it may seem, despite the thousands upon thousands of articles in technical journals on mental imagery, the distinction between eyes open and eyes closed mental imagery is not made. So people do not distinguish those two types of mental imagery. They treat it as the same, and some of the papers are with the eyes open, and they're just treating the results as the same as if they were eyes closed. So I think this establishes, well, it wasn't a great experiment. Others can do better experiments, but it was, I don't do great experiments. I just try to, you know, show that a quarter is more valuable than a dime. You know, something should be obvious, it seems to me. And so that establishes, I think, at least points to that there's a difference between projection and just plain mental imagery. The difference between augmented reality and virtual reality. So augmented reality, you're adding on to something out there, and virtual reality, you're making the whole thing up. So so that was that. And now the last area, what did I say I would cover? The last area, empirical results for what? I don't have any empirical results for the analysis of interactivity in architecture, but I do have a formal analysis. And the formal analysis is really simple. There are 3, interaction is a relation. It's a relation that A holds to B and B holds to A. But so you can ask the question, as you can for any relation. There are three attributes. Is it symmetric? Is it transitive? And is it reflexive? So symmetric says that if A causes B, if A is related to B, is B related to A in the same way? So if A is greater than B, symmetry doesn't hold. If A is equal to B, symmetry holds. Okay, now in causation, I mean in interaction, you have to have A can cause a change in B, so it's state change in B, and B causes a state change in A. If you don't have that, you just have one-way action. So we've got to distinguish between action and interaction. So a necessary condition of any theory of interaction, it seems to me, is that you have to start out by the assumption that it's symmetric. And most every, one will satisfy that, although every now and then people talk about interacting with their mental representations, and maybe they are, maybe they're not. It's much more complicated. The next one is transitivity. If A can cause a change in B and B causes a change in C, does A cause a change in C? And yeah. And so you may or may not think that interaction is transitive. Like those balls, the Galileo balls up here, you pick one up and, like that. So it looks like A is interacting with things, but it's mediated by all these things. So I have a big analysis for when the mediation is appropriate to consider it to be A interacts with this one. Imagine that you've got people on a tug of rope, so you got a team of people here and a team of people here. Am I interacting with the other people? Me by the rope? I think so, because I'm contributing to the force and they're contributing to the force. So that's a case of transitivity. When two of us are walking in step, we're interacting. When three of us are walking in step, am I interacting with the other person? So those are the kinds of questions. And are you looking at the time, Maria? And then the real question is so I had a big analysis of that. That was actually the substantive part of the really interesting thing, I thought, because ever since Merleau-Ponty and before, people talk about transparency of instruments. So the blind person with the proverbial cane, they don't, or a person with glasses, they don't see the glasses, they see through the glasses. The blind person with a cane, they don't perceive the cane, they perceive the cane on the ground, they perceive the ground through the cane because of the, because of the way. I can give a long story for that, but I won't. So there we would like to have, but of course the person is interacting with the cane and the cane is interacting with the ground. In no sense is my hand interacting with the ground except mediated by the cane, but of course it's very centrally mediated by the cane because of the way the conditions are propagated. I mean, the rigidity of the cane and so on. There's lots of reasons why you want to see that as transitive interaction. So I have a big theory about transparency and that sort of thing. All right. And then the last thing, and now, ordinary interactivity that we know in HCI satisfies the first one, the first condition of bidirectionality. Transitivity, usually, yes. Network causation, where there's a whole network of interactions that are going on. This is like the modern day network world of sensors and things, but also at home too. That satisfies both bidirectionality and symmetry, and transitivity. The last one is reflexivity. So equal, A is equal to B, A is equal to A, B is equal to B. In interaction, A causes a state change in B, B causes a state change in A. It's bizarre to say that A causes a state change in A and it's interacting with itself. But there are cases in which we might want to say that. Anyway, the analysis of that, how you can, is what makes architecture interesting, because only architectural interaction is reflexive. So I have a big paper on all of that. So with respect to the analysis, I got very excited when I said, you know, you've been thinking about interaction. Why don't you do it like a sensible logician would, and start with the mathematical properties of a relation? And then it started to fall out. So I'm interacting with myself. And I mean, you could say a part is interacting with another part, or you could say the system is interacting with itself. And so that's how, and then the people inside the architecture, they are interacting with the architecture is interacting with them, they're interacting with each other, and it's all you know, coming together in a reflexive manner as well. So I think architectural interaction is opening up something much more complicated, and it's interesting because the future of HCI will be building interaction. I mean, architectural interaction. So we have to understand computers are disappearing, right? They're already disappearing. So everything is being now handheld, and in the near future, it's all these sensors and actuators and everything everywhere, on us, on them, in body, on body, near body, all of that stuff. And so that's our world.
Infinite possibilities, always. David, I had to think about, now because of the cane, I had to think about that we could extend this discussion to include the topic of the body schema. But I'm afraid that maybe we are here already a little bit long, and we started early with our students, and I wouldn't want to overextend too much. So maybe I will just leave it hanging for our next conversation, the topic of the body schema. And I would just ask if Rafael has a question, because I think at some point he looked very responsive.
Not really. I just realized I did kind of the otherwise, or like the marking otherwise, because when I had to learn a lot of stuff, I memorized it through motions. So I memorized the motions first, and then I had like a little dance which I memorized, and then I knew, you know, like every movement was something I had to memorize. So I just did it kind of otherwise, so which I thought was interesting, realizing. Yeah, but no other further questions. Thank you very much.
But it's interesting because it talks about often we don't understand our thought. Okay. Do you think that your thoughts were well formed before you put them into your marking, or did the activity of putting it into the marking have an effect on the clarity of the thought, or whatever it is you were trying to encode? In the way in which formulating something in words or beginning to sketch it, you know, the sketch isn't fully there until you start to make it out, and then there's the interaction of the pen, and the pen doesn't move so fast here, and then it goes fast here. I mean, the ink comes out in certain ways, or you didn't quite appreciate, and oh wait, that's good, I'll just carry it on like that. You know, it's this interactive process where the end product emerges, even though you had a pretty clear idea of what you're aiming for. Something about the encoding, the properties of the material properties of the encoding medium affect the shape of the message. The medium shapes the message a little bit. Do you think that you had it all there in advance?
I think, yeah, and I think that's the point of the method, you know, like materializing it, getting it out of your head, kind of, which is also what we do with building models, because if you do it all in your brain, you always have to restart from the beginning. You know, you always have to rebuild your model in your head, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you change it. And then if you have a physical model, you just take the wall out or you just move it. I don't, maybe, yeah, it's just, yeah. Maybe I have to dance it, what I want to say.
Yeah, but I mean, the interesting thing is, if you were to dance it and you were to sketch it, I'll bet you would have slightly different outputs. I mean, obviously they would look different, but if you were to say what you had learned from it by dancing it, it might be quite different than what you learned from it by sketching it. And so there's got to be something about the medium there, the properties of the medium. Every medium has like notation. It's easy to do some things and harder to do other things. And so each medium gives you, certain properties that are good, which is why it's good to use multiple medium to get at something because of the material properties of the medium.
Exactly, and that's one of the goals of this course and also of the exercise, that they start incorporating also movement in this analysis and attunement to the movement to extend their design tools. That's really what I'm looking for. I don't know if Annalena would like to make a question, because Annalena is doing this really interesting project. She came up with this really cool idea of analyzing her movements in the virtual world. So using her hand movements, the analysis of both the movements that she does in the real with the hand and the avatars doing all the cognitive, very complex choreographies that are happening in the digital world. So I wonder if Annalena has a question.
Just a tiny question, because I was doing this like TikTok show kind of exercise the whole time. Like I found like dozens of scaffoldings around here to use. And is there another good example for this, like imagining a thing and then like trying to project it other than this tic-tac-toe thing?
Oh, well, projection is everywhere. It's everywhere. And you can project, people with more powerful imagery capabilities can project massive amounts of things just by seeing the world change in some way or adding on to it. But one of the exercises that my choreographer and most choreographers use for getting people to generate new movements, to be creative, is to ask them to do things like look around and find some interesting shapes or surfaces or curves in the room around you. And I guess looking at that sad and unfortunate dead plant, which I will replace soon, but that's got some interesting shapes and curves to it. And I could take a number of things. Those are hands back there, and they might have some curves. And then I mapped some of the shapes onto different parts of my body and different positions. And so now I'm going to do a very simple thing, which would just be to sketch the shape. So if I'm sketching, oh, you can't see what I'm pointing to. If I'm going to sketch the shape of that, with my shoulder, I might just go like that, right? Just like that. But if I were to do that with a different part of my body, my chin, or maybe my stomach, there would be different consequences for my body. If I take a more complicated shape, like, one of like that, it's easy to do with your hand, so you're never allowed to do it with your hand. You have to do it with some part of your body. Maybe I'd have to do that with my hip. And so my hip, I would have to bend down and do up something, do something like that. And now, so you get people to make movements that they wouldn't normally make by just something as simple as sketching. In this case, that's called sketching. Well, sketching has a different meaning, but I am just sketching the shape, the contour, with a body part. Now, it doesn't address what you're talking about. You made me think of it by saying, well, can we project onto different things? Now, the activity of using my body to sketch is not exactly projection, but it's not 100% different than projection either. There's something about the way that this relation that I'm building between the contour and my path through space. And so I'm seeing this as like that. And that is a kind of, it's like projection. Projection is a pretty big notion. You have to narrow it down to get it precise, to do things with it. But I think it's like just a huge topic that people don't really study. And so what your question raises to me is the possibility that not only can you see things on top of things, I mean, you can project in any modality. If I say, think of Beethoven's Fifth, da, 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 and now if I go da, 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 and I ask you to harmonize with that in your mind, you're projecting your sound, your auditory image. So images don't have to be just visual. Your auditory image on top of my externalizing. If you play an instrument and you play like a double violin concerto, I used to play violin, so double violin concerto, then when they start to play the one part, if you've played the other part, you start playing the other part in your head. So you're projecting, you're getting the rhythm right, and you're coming in at the right time and all of that. So you can project in any modality. I can have you project like feelings and stuff and tactile things, and a chef would have gustatory things or olfactory projections. All of those kinds of things are opportunities, which might play havoc with the notion of an affordance, by the way.
Okay, so I know that Margaret is not able to do a question because she's in Barcelona in the library, so she won't make any questions. So I guess that's it for now. I mean, I would have many more questions, and I would really love to have the opportunity to continue this conversation further at some point with David. But I'm already so happy and grateful that I know you're always so busy, and you spent almost 2 hours of your time with us. So thank you again, David, for accepting this invitation.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted. I'm sure you have just a great class there. So much fun.
We are having fun. At some point we will have the vernissage and finissage with the assignments, and I will send to all the speakers an invitation. So if you would like to, and if you have time, we would be very happy to have you with us again.
Okay.
Okay. So that's it for now. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, David, for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.